Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mbetso, in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. His birth name was Rolihlahla Mandela, which in the Xhosa language means troublemaker. Little did anyone know that this name would prove to be prophetic, though not in the way one might expect. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniaswa, was a chief in the Thembu royal family, and his mother, Nosekeni Fanny, was his third wife. Even though Mandela was born into a respected family, his early years were far from privileged. The South Africa he was born into was already deeply divided by racial segregation. Black South Africans were considered second-class citizens, with limited rights and opportunities. Mandela's father passed away when he was only 9 years old, a tragedy that would change the course of his life. Following his father's death, he was sent to live with Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo, the acting regent of the Thembu people. This move gave him access to a better education, something that many black children in South Africa could only dream of at the time. Even as a child, Mandela was different. He was curious, intelligent, and deeply aware of the injustices around him. His exposure to African traditions and leadership under the regent helped shape his views on governance and justice. But it wasn't until his teenage years that he started questioning the unfairness of the system that ruled South Africa. Mandela attended Clarkberry Boarding Institute and later Heeltown, both missionary schools that provided education to black students. In 1939, he enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, the only higher education institution for black South Africans at the time. However, Mandela's time at Fort Hare was short-lived. He was expelled in 1940 for leading a student protest against the university's policies, his first act of defiance against an unjust system. This moment was crucial because it showed that Mandela was not afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even at a young age. After leaving Fort Hare, he fled to Johannesburg to escape an arranged marriage set up by the regent. It was in Johannesburg that Mandela's political awakening truly began. The move to Johannesburg was a life-changing moment. Instead of living as a prince in the royal court, Mandela found himself in the bustling city, exposed to the harsh realities of apartheid. He took on various jobs to survive, working as a mine security guard and later as a law clerk, while continuing his studies through correspondence at the University of South Africa. It was here, in the heart of South Africa's economic capital, that Mandela first encountered activists and anti-apartheid leaders, including members of the African National Congress, ANC. Seeing the extreme poverty and oppression of black South Africans fueled his desire for change. By the time he officially joined the ANC in 1944, Mandela had transformed from a curious boy with big dreams into a determined young man ready to fight for justice. Mandela's involvement with the African National Congress, ANC, marked the beginning of his transformation from a young law student to a revolutionary leader. By the mid-1940s, apartheid was tightening its grip on South Africa, with laws that further restricted the rights of black citizens. Mandela, along with other young activists like Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, co-founded the ANC Youth League in 1944, believing that more radical action was needed to fight against the oppression imposed by the white minority government. At first, Mandela believed in peaceful protest, inspired by figures like Mahatma Gandhi. However, the government responded to these protests with increasing violence, forcing him and other leaders to reconsider their approach. By the early 1950s, Mandela became one of the key organizers of mass defiance campaigns, encouraging thousands of black South Africans to deliberately break apartheid laws through nonviolent civil disobedience. He traveled across the country, giving speeches and organizing strikes and boycotts. However, the government quickly labeled him a threat, leading to his first arrest in 1952. He was sentenced to 9 months of hard labor, marking the beginning of a long series of legal battles and arrests. Around the same time, he and Oliver Tambo opened South Africa's first black-owned law firm, providing free, or low-cost legal representation, to black South Africans facing discrimination. Things escalated in 1960 after the Sharpeville massacre, where police opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing 69 people. This event shocked the world and convinced Mandela that non-violent resistance alone would not end apartheid. He helped form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, which carried out acts of sabotage against government infrastructure. Mandela knew that a direct military confrontation against the powerful South African government would be impossible, so he focused on damaging symbols of apartheid rule, like power stations and government offices, while avoiding loss of life. His actions made him the most wanted man in South Africa. He went underground, constantly moving between safe houses, often disguising himself as a worker or a driver. In 1962, after secretly leaving the country to gather international support, he was arrested upon his return and sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, things took a turn for the worse when authorities linked him to a secret ANC hideout in Rivonia, where detailed plans for an armed struggle were discovered. In the famous Rivonia trial of 1964, Mandela and several ANC leaders were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The punishment for such crimes was death. During his trial, instead of begging for mercy, Mandela gave a powerful speech that would be remembered for generations. He declared, "I have walked a long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." In an even more defiant moment, he said, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society, in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Rather than sentencing him to death, the court sentenced Mandela to life in prison. At just 46 years old, he was sent to Robben Island, a brutal prison where he would spend the next 27 years of his life. His story, however, was far from over. Mandela's arrival at Robben Island in 1964 marked the beginning of nearly 3 decades of imprisonment. Isolated from the world, he and other political prisoners were subjected to harsh conditions, forced labor, and psychological torment. He was confined to a small, damp cell with only a thin mat on the floor to sleep on. Days were spent breaking rocks in a limestone quarry, where the blinding sun permanently damaged his eyesight. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. He was only allowed 1 visitor and 1 letter every 6 months. The apartheid regime's goal was clear: to break his spirit. But Mandela refused to be broken. Instead, he turned prison into a university. He and his fellow inmates educated each other, discussing politics, philosophy, and law in what became known as the Mandela University. He secretly wrote and smuggled out messages to keep the anti-apartheid movement alive. Even the guards, many of whom initially treated him cruelly, began to respect him. Despite his suffering, he held on to one belief: "I knew that one day I would walk free." As the years passed, Mandela's image as a political prisoner gained global attention. In the 1970s and 1980s, the anti-apartheid movement exploded worldwide. Governments, activists, and celebrities called for his release, and Free Nelson Mandela became a rallying cry across continents. The South African government, under increasing pressure, offered him conditional release multiple times, demanding that he renounce violence and the armed struggle. Each time, Mandela refused, declaring, "Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." By the late 1980s, apartheid was collapsing. South Africa faced economic sanctions, growing internal protests, and international condemnation. In 1989, President F.W. de Klerk came to power and realized that apartheid was no longer sustainable. He unbanned the ANC and announced the release of political prisoners. Finally, on February 11, 1990, after 27 years behind bars, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, raising his fist in victory before thousands of supporters. His release was not the end of the fight, but the beginning of South Africa's transformation. The world was watching. Could a country so deeply divided by racism and violence find a peaceful path forward? Mandela's greatest challenge was yet to come. After his release in 1990, Nelson Mandela faced one of the most difficult challenges of his life, negotiating the end of apartheid, while preventing South Africa from descending into civil war. The country was on the brink of chaos. Violent clashes between different political groups, government crackdowns, and deep racial tensions made peace seem almost impossible. Many feared that South Africa would spiral into a bloodbath. But Mandela remained firm in his belief that the only path forward was reconciliation, not revenge. Instead of seeking vengeance against the white minority government that had imprisoned him for 27 years, Mandela chose dialogue and diplomacy. He led negotiations with President F.W. de Klerk, working toward a peaceful transition to democracy. It was a delicate process, full of setbacks and moments where everything could have collapsed. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to dismantle apartheid without resorting to war. Finally, in April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections, in which people of all races were allowed to vote. For millions of black South Africans, it was the first time they had a voice in their country's future. The election was a moment of hope and transformation, and the world watched as Nelson Mandela, once a prisoner of the state, was elected as South Africa's first black president on May 10, 1994. His victory speech was a powerful declaration of a new era. Never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. As president, Mandela faced enormous challenges. Apartheid had left the country deeply divided, with extreme economic inequality and racial tensions. He focused on rebuilding South Africa through unity and reconciliation, rather than punishment. One of his most famous initiatives was the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which allowed victims of apartheid-era crimes to tell their stories while also giving perpetrators the chance to confess their actions in exchange for amnesty. Instead of seeking revenge, Mandela promoted forgiveness and understanding, believing that a nation could only heal by facing its past openly and honestly. Another powerful symbol of his leadership was his embrace of South Africa's national rugby team, the Springboks, which had been a symbol of white rule for decades. During the 1995 Rugby World Cup, Mandela famously wore the team's jersey as he presented the trophy to the captain, Francois Pienaar. This simple act of unity helped bridge the racial divide in a way that words alone could not. However, Mandela's presidency was not without difficulties. South Africa continued to struggle with poverty, crime, and economic disparities, and while his leadership was inspirational, many of these deep-rooted issues remained unresolved. Despite this, he chose to step down after just one term in 1999, setting an example of democratic leadership in a continent where many leaders clung to power indefinitely. Mandela had transformed his country, but his influence extended far beyond South Africa. He became a global symbol of resistance, peace, and justice, inspiring millions worldwide. Even after leaving office, he remained active in humanitarian efforts, particularly in the fight against HIV/AIDS, a crisis that was devastating South Africa. Even after stepping down as president in 1999, Nelson Mandela remained one of the most respected and influential figures in the world. Instead of retiring completely, he dedicated his time to humanitarian efforts, advocacy, and diplomacy, using his global platform to address critical issues. One of his greatest focuses was the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which was ravaging South Africa. At the time, the government was reluctant to take action, and there was widespread misinformation about the disease. In 2000, Mandela publicly criticized the government's slow response and launched the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which promoted awareness, treatment, and education about HIV/AIDS. This was deeply personal to him, especially after the tragic loss of his son, Matgatho Mandela, to the disease in 2005. Beyond South Africa, Mandela became an advocate for peace and human rights around the world. He worked to resolve conflicts in war-torn regions, supported education initiatives, and continued to fight against poverty. In 2007, he founded the Elders, a group of global leaders, including figures like Kofi Annan and Jimmy Carter, who used their experience to mediate conflicts and promote social justice worldwide. Even in his old age, Mandela remained deeply committed to the idea that one person can change the world through compassion and perseverance. As he grew older, his appearances became less frequent, but his influence never faded. His birthday, July 18, was declared Mandela Day by the United Nations, encouraging people around the world to spend 67 minutes doing acts of kindness, symbolizing the 67 years he spent fighting for justice. His final years were spent mostly in quiet retirement with his family, though the world continued to look to him as a moral compass. On December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela passed away peacefully at his home in Johannesburg. His death was met with an outpouring of grief and respect from every corner of the world. Leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people gathered to honor the man who had turned a nation's pain into a path for peace. His funeral was attended by presidents, prime ministers, and royalty, one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history, proving that his legacy transcended politics and borders. But Mandela's story did not end with his passing. His name continues to inspire millions to stand against injustice, to forgive rather than seek revenge, and to believe in the power of resilience and hope. His life is a testament to the idea that one person's courage can change the course of history. Nelson Mandela's life was filled with challenges, sacrifices, and victories, but beyond the historical milestones, he left behind powerful lessons that remain relevant today. His journey teaches us that true leadership is not about power, but about service. Despite being imprisoned for 27 years, Mandela never sought revenge. Instead, he chose forgiveness, understanding that a divided nation could only heal through unity. His approach to reconciliation reminds us that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Another lesson from his life is the power of resilience. Mandela faced oppression, humiliation, and hardship, yet he never abandoned his principles. He once said, "Do not judge me by my successes, judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again." His story is a reminder that perseverance in the face of adversity is what defines true greatness. Mandela also believed in education as the most powerful weapon for change. From his time studying law to his efforts in prison to educate fellow inmates, he understood that knowledge was the key to breaking cycles of oppression. He famously said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." His legacy challenges us to never stop learning and to use knowledge to empower ourselves and others. One of his most impactful lessons is the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it seems impossible. When Mandela started his fight against apartheid, change seemed out of reach. Yet, he refused to accept injustice as permanent. His life proves that no system of oppression is invincible when people unite with courage and determination. Finally, Mandela showed the world that peace is a choice. He had every reason to emerge from prison bitter and angry, but he chose a different path, one of hope, dialogue, and reconciliation. His leadership was not just about political victories, but about changing hearts and minds, proving that lasting change is built on compassion and inclusivity. As we look at the world today, filled with conflicts, inequalities, and injustices, Mandela's legacy is a call to action. He showed us that one person can make a difference, that change begins with courage, and that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. So, as we reflect on his extraordinary life, ask yourself, what can we learn from Nelson Mandela that we can apply in our own lives? How can we become the change we wish to see in the world? His story is not just history, it is a reminder of what is possible when we choose resilience, kindness, and unwavering belief in justice. Let his legacy inspire us to keep fighting for a better world. And with that, we conclude the incredible journey of Nelson Mandela. If you found his story inspiring, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what was the most powerful lesson you learned from Nelson Mandela? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.